you and your family. I hope things are going well with you. And I just kind of wanted to come a little bit and talk a bit about ancient Kush. So I hope that you were doing well. God bless you. I hope that things are well with you. And I've been having Kush on my heart and on my mind. And I'm going to do a series around ancient Kush and really dig into the pre-idea of Kush, how the civilization and society lasted for so long, their religious beliefs. There's so much to talk about. I'll probably never stop talking. It'll probably be never ending. So I thank you so much for joining me. I hope that you have a good one. I just want to kind of jump in. I'm going to be also releasing a course about ancient Kush, an online course very soon. Actually, a series of online courses very soon that you can take, whether you are a member here or not a member here. I'm going to be offering up in a different way to a lot of people. So if you're interested in, please join me here. We're going to be doing online courses, and we're going to talk a little bit about ancient Kush and try to get into, what's going on with this wonderful civilization and the people that were here and how much they did. So I want to kind of jump into it. And as I think about ancient Kush, when we start to think about ancient Kush and what ancient Kush meant to people and really what was going on with respect to the whole area around the whole Nile Valley, we really have to get ourselves in a mindset where we just give up this whole idea that history started a certain time ago, that it started 3,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago or whatever it is. We have a very limited way of talking about history, of thinking about history. So thank you so much for joining. God bless you. We have such a very limited way of thinking about history. We have it in our mindset as if, we talk about maybe the Greeks, or we talk about the Romans, or we may talk about people from other parts of the world, and we act as if that's the only thing that's going on in the world. Human beings have been here for hundreds of thousands of years. Human ancestral beings have been here for millions of years. The earth is billions of years old. Human beings and our ancestors have been here for millions of years, and Homo sapiens, just like you and I, have been here for at least 300,000 years, hundreds of thousands of years. So the idea that history started 3,000 years ago, we just have to forget that. And when we talk about ancient Kush and we get into the concept of ancient Kush, we really have to jump into that. So God bless you. Thank you, Poet Williams. I very much appreciate that. God bless you. I thank you so much for doing that. So just want to say thanks very much. I very much appreciate you sharing us. All of that very much helps. So thank you so much, Poet Williams. I very much appreciate that. It helps to kind of move things forward. So I very much appreciate that. And I'm going to be doing a lot more, even some more with math and various things I'm going to be doing to really help us out. Because when I think about the things our ancestors did, when you think about how long human beings have been around and been on this earth, there's so many things that we've done, mathematics and all kinds of science and language and religion and art and so many things that we've done. We just put ourselves in a box. And when we start to think about ancient Kush and we start to think about various things with respect to Kemet, it takes us back far. We're not just going back to a short period of time. We're going back to a significant place and a significant time in history. And I want to kind of talk about that and share that a little bit, because as we start to dip into that, thanks so much, 30,000 years ago. So even as you mentioned that extra money, 30,000 years ago is important. So that's just going to say thank you again. So I appreciate that. So it's just going to be, when you think about that, thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, we're talking about a significant time in history where people have been doing things. And as we put this stuff on our mind, especially when we begin to talk about the Nile Valley, there's so many things that happen in the Nile Valley that are significant. And human beings have been up and down this whole area. When you think about the Nile Valley, when you think about how, the types of things, and we're looking at some remains from the ancient capital that was part of Kush thousands of years ago. There's some remains of that right there. When you start to think about just the Nile Valley itself and many other things that have been done. And I'm taking a look at this particular graphic that's up there. People, as I've mentioned, have been up and down the Nile Valley for tens of thousands of years. Human beings have been around here for hundreds of thousands of years, and obviously our ancestors for millions of years. And when you think about that, you can't stop that whole idea, that traffic that's going up and down the Nile. So we shouldn't really even think about, when we think about ancient Kush, when we think about ancient Kemet, we shouldn't even really think about it just within this respect of, this is the exact point in time within which it started. Everything that happens in human beings' history is always a flow. There's always a beginning. There's always somebody you don't know about who helped to start something. So we like to put a line in the sand, and some people will say the ancient Kemet started 3,100 years ago, and that was the joining of the two kingdoms. But actually, when you look at the archaeological evidence, you will find that the cultures that were up and down the Nile were blending, and they just particularly name it the Dynasty 1 or Dynasty 0. People have been around there for longer than that, practicing some of the same customs, a lot of the same customs. So it's really hard to just draw a line in the sand, so to speak, and to point and say it started in this date. But when we think about ancient Kush and we start to think about that whole area, we are talking about a period of time where people have been around prior to Kemet starting, prior to all that. People were there, and they're in that area around the third cataract of Nile. So if you look at where it says Upper Nubia right there, and take a look at where it says Kerma, you will find a whole plethora of archaeological evidence that shows that people are up and down the Nile Valley, obviously, because they're there. This is Eastern Africa. You find some of the oldest remains of human beings in this area. Of course, they're going to be there. They're up and down this area. And one of the things you find with the Nile didn't always have the same course. A lot of times when you look at things in terms of history, you also have to study climate and things that are changing around people and agriculture. And, at the end of the day, a lot of times, even today, all the sophistication that we think we have today, we're still looking for water. And in a lot of ways, clean water, food, being able to survive. Many people are in situations, especially now, where it's hard to just, make ends meet. That's not very much different than what they were experiencing tens of thousands of years ago. They're thinking about food. They're thinking about water. They're thinking about their families. How do you live safely? How do you live in peace? All those questions are taking place in the Nile Valley 10,000 years ago. And when you think about that, the Nile River itself is not always flowing on the same course. So the part that's in the Sahara Desert that's very dry now, one of the hottest places on earth, wasn't always like that. There's a period of time where it was grassland, and there's a period of time when things kind of erode and things kind of grow and things kind of go in cycles. There was a period of time around 9,000 years ago when the Sahara was a grassland. And some of the things you see today were not exactly the way they were. And even the Nile itself had a bit of a different course. So if you kind of speed that up and go back some 5,000 years BC and 5,000 years BC, you start to see that the Nile was a little bit more easterly. So it was a little more to the east. And people in this part of what is today Sudan were setting up camp. You had people that were there some 5,000 BC, setting up camp right there around what today we call Kerma, this area that we call Kerma. The people were there. They were setting, but there was a little farther east, and they had settlements. They were trading. Long before Kemet becomes Dynasty 0 or Dynasty 1, there's ivory already in the Mediterranean. there's trade going up and down long before Kemet becomes Kemet. You have gold from Nubia, and you have exotic animals and things like ivory, as I mentioned. You have products from Kemet going down farther south and in parts of Africa, farther in Africa. That's already taken place. And so people, even 5,000 BC, are in this area, and they're settling, and they're following the Nile. And the Nile changes course. It's a little farther east in the Sudan than where it is today. It kind of takes a bit of a westerly turn, and people start to follow it. And as people start to follow the course of the Nile, you start to see them come close to what that area is that we call Kerma. And Kerma is more of a modern term. It's not really necessarily a term that they used way back when. It's more of a modern term. But that particular area becomes kind of a choke point where it becomes an urbanized area, an urbanization point where people start to gather around that area because they're looking for water and they're settling. And obviously the Nile is depositing very rich silt, if you will. And they are setting up camp, if you will. They're setting up settlements, and they eventually set up governments, and they eventually set up, society. And one of the things that this area has as a significant advantage to it is that you can look at where it's located. Think about the Horn of Africa, and think about where we believe the God's land of Punt was located, farther east. Think about things farther south where they have things like ebony that's growing and dolomite and all types of diorite and all types of precious stones and resins and myrrhs and things that become very significant in ancient Kemetic religious philosophy and iconography, whether it's ostrich feathers, the famous ostrich feathers you'll see on a lot of ancient Kemetic religious iconography and things of that nature. You see ostrich eggs and panther skins and all types of things. Many of those things come from farther south. They come from Africa. Central Africa, right? Obviously, it's part of Africa, but Central Africa. And you see these things going up and down the Nile thousands of years ago. And so when we start to ask ourselves, when does Kush start, right? There's an idea and evidence that there are people and what is today we call Kerma, around the third cataract of Nile, what will become the capital of ancient Kush, if you will. There are people there. What they call themselves, we don't know, right? We aren't 100% sure what they called themselves 5,000 years BC. We do know that around the 6th dynasty of ancient Kemet, some 2500 BC, some 4,500 years ago, they were calling this area around Kerma, around the third cataract of the Nile, they were calling it Yam. So if you look back as the Adventures of Harkuf, God bless you. Thank you, Paul. Thank you so much for doing this. I very much appreciate it. And thank you so much just for the support and the thanks you. I very much appreciate that. That kind of helps me go and keep going. So I really appreciate it. There's so much that we have to get out of there. So around 4,500 years ago, you start to see people in ancient Kemet use the word yam. They use it in communications that they have with people who are traveling from ancient Kemet, going farther south beyond what is today the border of the Sudan and ancient Kemet and Egypt today. So you find it, God bless you. All right. And it's a long way away from Central Africa. So they're traveling a long way to get there. This trade network was very far. So you find that ancient Kemet in the 6th dynasty, some 4,500 years ago, they are mentioning the word yam. They're talking about people. So and it's very important as you think about this, that you understand that the Nubia that we talk about, the Nahesi, if you will, that are part of the southern part of ancient Kemet and even going just below the first cataract, even before ancient Kemet was a country or unified, if you will, you had people that were identified as A group Nubians. This George Reisner, who was a Harvard archaeologist who was somewhat racist, who did a lot of studies in this area, identified a group that they called A group Nubians. And so when you look at them, even 3800 BC, before Kemet is unified, before Kemet is Kemet, you find Nubians all up and down, even within the borders of what is today, Egypt, and within the borders of what will become ancient Kemet. So Nubians are there, Nubians with distinct cultures. And I think it's very important when we think about this to understand that, one, there's a lower Nubia, there's an upper Nubia, and a lot of times when people think about Nubia, excuse me, they lump it all together and they don't give credence to the fact that these were people, brothers and sisters, right? But people who developed their own distinct societies. So you could have had obviously the Medjay, people we call the A group. You had the Urjet, the Wawet, the Yam Nubians. These are all people that Nahesi, these are all people that the Kemetic people named. It wasn't just the people on the third cataract of Nile. And when they talk about Nubia a lot of times and they mention it, a lot of times they're talking about lower Nubia further to the north. They're not even talking about the area that will become Kush or Yam. They're talking about other people and they lump them all together as if to say ancient Kemet dominated all of Nubia in its entire time. That's just not the case. The kingdom that would become Kush, the kingdom that was at first called Yam, if you will, that's right around the third cataract of Nile, had a powerhouse. As I mentioned, they were coming closer to the Nile, some 5,000 BC and closer to where the Nile is today as the Nile started to change course. And they set up settlements and they set up trade and they had a religion and they venerated cattle just like they did in Nabta 9,000 years ago. They had ceremonies, they had buildings, they built a fortified city. So when we start to look at this and we start to kind of take a picture, they built a fortified city that will become a lot of what we see today. So as we start to look at this and we start to see the history that they bring about and some of the temples that they end up creating a civilization that lasted for thousands of years. It isn't just one place. They're developing a civilization that lasted for thousands of years. And as we put that kind of in our mindset, we start to understand that they are at this period of time developing a society where you're just bringing more people together. And why do people come together? Why is it that people develop urban societies? Because this area around Kerma, around 3,500 BC, some 5,500 years ago, it's becoming urbanized. It's not that people aren't all over Africa. It's not that people aren't all over the world. We're just in this particular area, people are becoming urbanized. And one of the reasons is because of the search for water and because of the natural trade that was going on up and down the Nile. The Nile is a watery highway. It's a magnificent highway. And we start to look at it, you can see that even and I'll just kind of take myself away. Even when you see and look at this particular vase right here, you see that they're evident. That's a boat that's up there with oars in there and rowing. You see them, they're using boats thousands of years BC. They're using boats thousands of years ago to go up and down this watery highway, to go up and down the Nile. So that becomes an area where you can trade. You can bring things up and down and you can go up and down, especially during the flood season. And it becomes like a highway. And obviously going over land becomes more and more difficult as the desert continues to dry out and the Sahara continues to dry out and grow. It becomes very important to have a highway that's water that you could put heavy things on and travel long distances. So this area of Kerma becomes a natural kind of choke point, if you will. If you were coming from the highlands of Ethiopia or from the area of Punt or farther south in Africa, you had trade, you had the ability, because as you know, the Nile has several main tributaries, one coming from Ethiopia that's providing the majority of the water. And there's a whole lot going on now with the dam that the Ethiopians want to build. But one coming from Ethiopia, another coming from Kenya and the Great Lakes area down and farther south in Africa, farther south in Tanzania, in that area, you see that also coming. And these tributaries is another main tributary as well. These tributaries kind of meet in Khartoum. They meet in what is today the Sudan. So imagine this massive flow, one of the longest rivers in the world, this massive flow of water, a natural water highway, all meeting together in what is today the Sudan. And there are several rocky areas that make it kind of difficult to travel up and down the Nile. That's what a cataract is. And it's several times a year is difficult to travel. But as you get through there, especially during the flood season, you can go a long way. And this area around Kerma becomes a natural trading point. It becomes a hub for people who are traveling up and down the Nile, who are bringing their resources from the east. You're closer to the Red Sea. People who might be in the eastern desert or the western desert, coming farther south, as well as Kemetic people who are coming down, who would like to have panther skins and myrrh resins and visit God's land, places from God's land. This area that is Kerma, that would become Kush, becomes a center for that. So as it becomes a center for that, you start to see why it's important. And it's important in its own right. We don't have to talk about Kush and Yam, and if you will, just within the context of Kemet, right? Kemet doesn't just validate it. This is a place that's developing its own customs, its own ways. And it's not that they don't share customs with people in Kemet. They obviously do. This is all part of one big Nile Valley family, people, one big Nile Valley community, but they have distinctions. Just like you and I will have distinctions, or you might live in Chicago and somebody else lives in LA and somebody else lives in wherever. Their distinction doesn't mean they're not related, doesn't mean they don't have a shared custom and heritage, and a shared heritage, if you will, but they do have distinctions. And so you start to see the people that are around this third cataract of Nile and what is today Kerma, they have their own government, they have their own rulers. They set up an immense fortified city. So when we think about just where they are and kind of what they're developing, they're setting up an immense fortified city, and this city becomes huge. And this is part of it. And this is a latter version of the city, because obviously it lasted for so long. But this is a city that becomes fortified. And the part that you see right there was a temple that was the center of the city that's built even 3500 BC. You start to see this development of early temples and early things in this area of Kerma. They're developing and worshiping God. They have their own burial customs. They're in a situation where sometimes they may bury people with them. They may have human sacrifice, but in a different way than maybe we think about. Some of them may have been voluntary, but just by the way it's looked and some of the archaeological finds around it. But human sacrifice, they even have customs where they bury people with beds, where they're very much religious. There's so many religious institutions and so many military strategic things built in ancient Kerma. And this ancient Kerma, at the time when the Kemetic people were calling it Yam, some 4,500 years ago, they have a large, immense, and elaborate military bastions and lookout points and archers and roadways and storehouses and workshops and goldsmithing and ceramic pottery making, which is some of the finest pottery making in the ancient world, according to people. All of this is developing some 3,500 BC in what is today what we call Kerma, right there on the third cataract of Nile. So if you kind of take a look at this right here and look at this PDF and this timeline, if you want, I'll kind of make it a little bigger so you can see it just a little bit. You'll start to see that this whole area around this time, you start to go in 3,500 BC, this area is starting to pop. This whole area around Kerma is starting to pop. You start to see them developing a lot of temples. You start to see them interacting with each other. And it isn't until around the middle kingdom of ancient Kemet. It isn't until around maybe 1900 BC or thereabouts, somewhere around there, 2000 BC, 1900 BC, or 1800 BC, 1700 BC, where you start to see the name Kush being used in Kemetic documents. You start to see the word Kush being used. Now, at what point in time did they go from Yam to Kush? Was this just a change in rulership? Was it a change in dynasties? Was it a change in actual people, or just a natural progression? We're not 100% sure. But we do know when they started referring to the word Kush around 1900 BC, sometime in the Middle Kingdom in the 12th dynasty, you start to see this area that is Kerma still there. It's still the capital of this area. It's still a thriving area. they still have many things that they're developing and that they're pulling forth. So this becomes something that's not just a little bit. You still see them developing this area around Kerma and doing a lot of things with that, even when they start to call it Kush. So when we start to ask ourselves the question, when did ancient Kush actually start? Right? You have to understand that the history of it and the ancestors of it goes back many thousand years, well before the time of ancient Kemet, well before the time that we like to put a line in the stand and say this is what's happening. This area around Kerma, around the third cataract of the Nile, becomes an area that's urbanized. It becomes an area that people are up and down, even 5,000 BC, even well before that. People are up and down the Nile. I mean, you got Lucy, if you will, in Ethiopia millions of years ago. People are up and down the Nile for hundreds of thousands of years. And so it's hard to say when exactly this was developed by the people who would be the ancestors. More than likely, their ancestors were there for thousands of years, tens of thousands of years. But it isn't until 5000 BC, and then you get around 3500 BC, that you start to see this explosion in trade that we've identified. It does not mean that there weren't other things there. Some of the stuff is even buried in the dam that they built, some years ago. And some of it may just be buried with time. A lot of times people were using mud brick, and they were using tools, and they were using resources that go back into the earth, some of which we may not even know or identify or acknowledge because we just haven't seen it because it's been so long. But we begin to pick this time, if you will, around 3500 BC, where this urbanization is taking place in Kerma. And one of the things that's interesting about it is, I kind of thank you so much. God bless you. I appreciate it. Thank you so much for joining. Yes. Yam. And I'd love to hear as much as you'd like to say. I very much appreciate that. But, I said it, and I said Lucy. I know somebody put in the comments, not Lucy, but I said Lucy because I really think we have to just stop this mindset of everything started with a line. And we do that from a Western standpoint, where we just want to put grease at the head of everything. And so we got to put a line in it, and we have to act like what's taking place in the Mediterranean or in the continent of Europe is all that's taking place around the world. I mean, if you go back 1200 BC, the Olmecs are blossoming and have been blossoming in South America. You have what's taking place in the Far East and what we call China today. You have people have been in Australia for 60,000 years. You cannot go back and do just 2,000 or 3,000 years of history. It goes beyond that. And the same thing applies to the Nile Valley. The Nile Valley is no different. People are there. People have gone in and out of Africa thousands of times, tens of thousands of times by the time 3500 BC comes around. Tens of thousands of times. So when you get to 3500 BC and 2500 BC, you see the Kemetic people, you hear the Kemetic people calling it the land of Yam. By the time you get to around 1900 BC or thereabouts, you start to hear it being called Kush. And from that time on, it's called Kush. And there's amazing things that they do. They start to not only have this area around the third cataract of Nile be the capital, if you will. There are three main areas, although there are many more, that develop in ancient Kush that become significant, right? So not just the area of Kerma, but also the area of Napata and the area of Meroe. So their empire expands. They aren't just at the third cataract of the Nile anymore. As time goes on, they expand into the fourth cataract of the Nile as a part of their official proper kingdom, if you will. And then they go farther down in between the fifth and sixth cataract with the area of Meroe. And so you find that the Kush is not only, taking place some 3500 BC with the foundations of this specific area and this specific society, if you will, and this continuum of people, but it goes on for an extended period of time, even after the New Kingdom. People like to talk about Kush within the context of the New Kingdom, but even after the New Kingdom, who was there for about 400 and so some odd years, controlling it, even after they left, they'll go on for another 1200 years, go on for another 1,000 years after the New Kingdom falls, after the New Kingdom is not there anymore. They go on for another 1,000 years with a remarkable dynasty and with remarkable people. And we're going to get more specific to them, because I want to delve into not just what was happening prior to, the classic Kerma, if you will, prior to some of the pre-Kerma activities. I want to delve into what was happening in this heyday. What happened with the Napatan dynasty? What happened with the Meroitic dynasty? What did they believe? What do we know? How can we talk about them today? Because I think they have something to tell us. I think they have something to teach us. I think that when you consider the ability that they had dynasties that lasted for over 1,000 years within the same family, you know what I mean? That's the other remarkable part. When I'm showing you this right here from the Napatan period, which we'll talk about in a future broadcast, this is the same line. This is a line that goes on for hundreds and hundreds of years. How do you keep a family together for 1,000 years? How do you keep something together for over 1,000? How do you do that? What type of practices are you putting in place? What type of respect do you have for one another, men for women and women for men, for your ancestors, for your children? What types of things are you doing that allows you to maintain your society for well over 1,000 years? Who does that? And they're not just doing it in this time period. They're doing it before that as well, as we go farther back in history with the people from ancient Kush. So I wanted to kind of touch on that, and I want to see, what some of the comments are in the chat here. God bless you, Taseti, right? And you're talking about the land of the bow, and Yam is the birth of Kush. So interesting. So God bless you as well. Peace and blessings. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. You're right. Keep going. I very much appreciate that. So when you think about it, think about Yam as you when you do your research, and if you do the autobiography of Harkuf, and I have a lot of these resources available on my site for those who are members. I thank you so much for supporting me. I know it's $4.99 a month. I very much appreciate it. $5, a little less than $5 a month. I very much appreciate it. I'm trying to put as many of these resources out so that you can read them, and maybe a lot of you have resources as well that you can share with us. But if you look at the whole idea of the autobiography of Harkuf, if you look at the autobiography of Winnie, if you look at a lot of the resources, you'll see them not only mention Yam, which is around this third cataract of the Nile, you also see them mention the Urjet, the Wawet, the Medjay, and the Wawet and the Urjet are in Lower Nubia. So I don't want to diss them or ignore them or disrespect them, because there are all kinds of people here developing societies. And when they first mention, it's very interesting, which we'll talk about again, when they first mention the word Kush, if you will, in the Middle Kingdom, and they reference that with respect to probably a war or some type of conflict that was going on between ancient Kemet and Kush, they don't just mention Kush. They mentioned some odd groups that were a part of a coalition, really, that was fighting against ancient Kemet. Kush was just the first one mentioned, and Kush becomes a name that's used later on for Kasha and Napatan dynasty, and they continue to use that. But it wasn't the only group of people. It wasn't the only society. It wasn't the only government, right? The government that they set up in Kush was a dominant one, and apparently it was either the leader or maybe the largest, but there were other people all up and down this area. So I wanted to kind of get that, but there's something about Kush that resonates. I feel it's something about Kush that resonates in our heart and allows us to think about. So I want to dig into their dynasty. I want to dig into their religion, their beliefs. And I hope you'll join me next time. I hope you'll come back, and I hope you'll contribute, because I know there's a wealth of information out there in the chat and in the comments. I very much appreciate it. I hope that you'll communicate and share some of the things, and I hope you'll be back with me soon. God bless you. Thank you so much for joining me.